Well, welcome. Thank you so much for tuning in here virtually, and thanks to the Spark organization for hosting. I'm really excited to be here and talk about a project that's been developing over the past decade or so right here on campus, or at least right here on our virtual campus. And that's trying to better understand how emotion is communicated in music. Now, I know we have people here from a lot of different areas, so I wanted to just start off with a sort of brief overview of what music perception is. So music perception, the way I think of it, is a combined effort to understand the guts of how music works, understanding how the decisions that composers make in structuring pieces, or how performers make decisions in performing them, how they affect the way in which we interact with and experience music. And I think at its best, when we're doing music psychology, we can not only understand music, but explore issues that also help us understand how our minds work. Now, I'm biased, but I think music is a particularly valuable thing for us to study because it's a stimulus that's evolved over many, many generations. And if you think about sort of the way our minds evolve from an evolutionary perspective, they reflect certain properties of the environment and our ancestral environment and the world in which we were evolving. In a sense, we have a similar thing with music, except here, the environment in which music evolved is actually the mind of the listener. So I think music psychology is a wonderful field. And again, I'm biased. I'm the secretary for the Society for Music Perception and Cognition, but I think it's a great thing because we can both understand music better from an artistic perspective and also use it to answer some really important and really pressing scientific questions. So one of the challenges in the field of music psychology is that there's very different ways of going about how to understand music. So music theorists will often go about understanding musical structure through analysis in terms of analyzing a musical score. This is the kind of training I received in my undergraduate and my graduate school program, which is very, very important in understanding this ephemeral, complex auditory phenomena, because the score captures exactly what the composer was intending. It can be a valuable source of insight. Now, the challenge with analyzing scores is that there's many different things happening at once in music. One of the reasons we like it so much is that it's a very, very complex thing. And so as a counterpart, experimental psychologists will often engage in very controlled experiments. And so here, the beauty of this is that we can manipulate different things very cleanly to have great confidence that the conclusions we make actually are not confounded by some other variable that's intervening. So I think both of these have some value. The interesting thing is they sort of incentivize us to go about this task of understanding music in very, very different ways. So one of the ways in which this really comes to the forefront is looking at the kinds of sounds or the stimuli that we use in music research. So on one hand, from a musical perspective, we might use things like a recording of a well-known piece by a very highly regarded pianist. On the other hand, a lot of experimental work on music psychology takes a different approach and use very controlled stimuli, which are generated by a computer, so we don't have any kinds of problems with interpreting the performer's way of performing. So as you can hear, that second one, I think, lacks some of the richness of what really matters in the musical experience. Now, I chose that intentionally because I think it's actually one of the better examples of a controlled recording. It's actually made with real high quality sounds, but there's no expressive timing or no expressive variation in there. So just to go back to our previous discussion, I think this is emblematic of both the different perspectives on trying to explore music psychology and also the different ways in which we go about this, whether we're emphasizing more understanding the art form or understanding what this can tell us about how the mind works. So one issue in which I think we can see this tension playing out is one of the oldest and most fascinating questions in all of music psychology, and that's the relationship between speech and music. This is something that actually predates the field of music psychology itself. Darwin speculated that the expressiveness of music might be rooted in the kinds of vocalizations used by our evolutionary ancestors. And this idea was expanded upon, I think, very nicely in a wonderful book by Stephen Meighton, where he explores archaeological and psychological and neuroscientific ways of going about understanding the relationship between speech and music. But even Darwin's interest is certainly not the first recorded example we have of this. The ancient Greeks would often speculate about whether music's ability to express emotion derives from the kinds of ways in which we express emotion in speech. I think if you're interested in this topic, a wonderful summary can be found in Ani Patel's book, Music, Language, and the Brain, where he unpacks this in great detail. So I wanted to start off with these two foundational books because I think it shows the breadth and depth of interest in the connections between speech and music. And in particular, how we can learn about emotional communication in music by understanding emotional communication in speech. Because if we look at how emotion is communicated in speech outside of the verbal content, outside of the semantic content, we know two of the big cues are the speed with which the speaker is speaking and also the pitch. And so if I told you at the beginning of this talk, welcome everyone, I am very excited to have you here, you probably wouldn't believe the semantic content, my greeting, because those cues of speaking slow and speaking low are very powerful cues that are not conveying happiness. We see similar things in music, where controlled experiments have shown that if we take a stimulus and make it faster or slower, or change the pitch height to be higher or lower, we get the predicted outcomes in terms of the emotional communication, things that parallel the way those cues are used in speech. Now, music, though, has a special cue, sort of a bonus cue, and that is the cue of modality. So modality has to do with the grammar or the structure of music, and music theorists talk a lot about the distinctions between the scale structure. I think the really important thing from our perspective is that modality is generally recognized, at least amongst a lot of psychologists, as contributing to affect, in that the major key has a happy sound and the minor key has a sad sound. And so a lot of major key pieces that sound really happy and upbeat are major, and ones that are slower and minor tend to sound very sad. So these are the three cues that are really dominant in music research. Now, the interesting thing is that I've gotten more involved with this. I've realized that actually a lot of music theorists are not really a big fan of this idea about major correlating with happy and minor with sad. They'll point out to many interesting exceptions where it's actually a piece that has a very somber tone, but it happens to be in a major key, or vice versa. And so this has led to some interesting tension and conflict, I think, between the music psychology and the music theory worlds. So it's interesting to keep that in mind in context of this project, because the data I'm going to show to you today, I think, present to bear directly on this question. So I've laid out a big sort of high-level overview of some of the background issues guiding this work. But I got to be honest with you, the actual start of this project didn't come from an informed reading the literature or going through a bunch of journal articles, but actually started with a slightly different source. So you might be familiar with a great television show called Saturday Night Live. Years ago, they had a wonderful routine with a comedian, Steve Martin, who was also a fantastic banjo player. And he did this sketch to be humorous, but I think it actually raises some really interesting music psychology questions. But here, you be the judge.
You know, banjo's such a happy instrument. It really is. It's a good thing for a comedian like me, and just a happy thing, you know. That happy? You just can't sing a depressing song when you're playing the banjo. You can't go, oh, murder and death and grief and sorrow. Really, when you're with me, it's like being at Shakey's Pizza, you know? It's just...
So it's funny for a lot of reasons. I mean, he's got an arrow through his head and it's Steve Martin, so pretty much everything he does is really comedic gold. But in addition to that, it actually raises a really interesting question. Why is it you can't play sad music on the banjo? Years ago, a very prominent music psychology researcher named David Huron saw this sketch and he started wondering, what is it that makes the banjo such a darn happy instrument? I think part of it has to do with the construction of the instrument. The way it's built means that it plays pitches that are relatively high, and because the notes don't ring for very long, it's common for banjo players to strum a lot of notes per second, a very fast rate. And high pitch height and fast rates of articulation are big cues for happiness. So I thought it was really fascinating that maybe some instruments are constructed in a way that doesn't really give them the emotional palette to explore certain kinds of expressions. And so we started talking about this and how neat it would be to use music psychology to try and explore this and unpack this. In terms of an issue that informs artistic practice versus informs our study of the brain, I think it's very much on the artistic side. And it was something that was fascinating to me as a performing musician. Because you see, in addition to researching music psychology, I'm an active performing percussionist. And in fact, I direct our percussion ensemble here at McMaster. And the reason David wrote to me years ago is that he came up with this brilliant idea where we could look at the repertoire for two instruments that are similar in many ways, but also different on the dimensions that matter. So if you're not real familiar with the marimba and the xylophone, let me give you my standard explanation now. The marimba and xylophone are both tuned wooden bar percussion instruments, but the marimba has a very wide range of pitch. The xylophone is much narrower and higher. And because the bars in the marimba ring for a long period of time, you can play fast or slow. The bars on the xylophone don't ring for very long. So like the banjo, xylophone music tends to use a lot of notes to fill up the space. Now, if you haven't heard as many xylophone or marimba performances as I have, I'll play you some examples here. And since I'm out traveling abroad, I can't do the performances myself, so I brought in some recordings. So here's a standard marimba tune. It's got a bit of a somber tone. So in contrast, here's a fairly standard tune for the xylophone. Okay, I could listen to that all day, but we've got to cut it off at some point here. So xylophone music has a bit of a happier feel. And having played a lot of these pieces, as soon as David proposed the study, I knew exactly how it was going to turn out because I played dozens and dozens of solos for each instrument, and I couldn't ever recall playing something sad on the xylophone. Nonetheless, that's not a proper way to do research. So to really quantify this and explore the issue, we used a database of programs from percussion recitals supplied by the Percussive Arts Society. We went through and picked pieces that had a certain level of prominence, looked at what kind of keys they were using at the beginning and the end, and did some number crunching. And what we found is, I think, one of the clearest effects I have ever seen. So on the y-axis here, we're looking at the percentage of modality observations. And we found that for the marimba pieces, they were sometimes starting in major keys, more often ending in major keys. We also found that a lot of them were post-tonal or atonal, meaning they didn't have a clear tonal center. What's important for our purposes here is just that looking at the relative ratio of major key pieces to minor key pieces, it's clear that overall the marimba repertoire definitely leans minor. So it's useful to think about this as a baseline. On an instrument that can play high or low or fast or slow, we see a repertoire that's tending to lean a bit towards minor. What about when we look at the repertoire for the xylophone, which is an instrument that's constructed like the marimba, but now it can only play high and only play fast? Well, you don't need a bunch of statistical tests to see that here, the repertoire for the xylophone is overwhelmingly written in major keys. Now, that part wasn't really shocking to me, but what I did not expect is what we realized next. Because you see, there's a couple examples of xylophone tunes that started minor keys. And these all ended major keys, but it's at least an attempt by a composer to try to introduce minor key repertoire for the xylophone. The thing is, when I looked at those pieces, I remembered hearing a lot of performances of them on the marimba, but actually never on the xylophone. And I hadn't really thought about this much before. So I decided to write to everyone in the database who had played those couple pieces that started minor on the xylophone. And it turns out every single performance of these was actually given on the marimba. And when I asked people why they did this, I got these very interesting comments like, I don't know, I just don't really like the sound of that piece on the xylophone. Someone even suggested maybe you could use the marimba for slow portions of that piece and the xylophone for faster sections. But my favorite response came when I asked someone about what their performance choice was for a piece literally called Sonata for Xylophone. And as it turns out, all these performances were given on the marimba. And when asked why, one performer wrote back, I've always just thought the piece sounded better on marimba. In fact, I can't ever remember hearing a performance on the xylophone. I wish I had something more profound to tell you, but it's just that simple. And this is one of the things that I find so fascinating about the field of music psychology is that it can actually help me understand some things in the art aspect of this that I noticed before, but had never actually thought about. And so it seems like at the end of the day, the xylophone, very much like the banjo, has been typecast as this happy instrument. And the reason for that is because it seems to be restricted to some of the same kinds of acoustic affordances that we see with the xylophone. So this is a study I published just before I started here at McMaster, and it left me with a really strong interest in trying to better understand both how emotion is communicated in music and also what the connections are between music and language. And in looking at this more, I realized we have a sort of problem here in music. Because you see, in speech research, there's a lot of databases of different kinds of speech samples because a lot of people are pretty good at speaking. And so we can assemble corpora of people, say, speaking, actors coming in to speak the same sentence in a happy versus sad manner, or databases of people speaking naturally and spontaneously when we know they happen to be happy or know they happen to be sad. This kind of thing is a little bit harder in music because we have many, many more fluent speakers than we do fluent composers. And we can't exactly go back in time and ask Mozart to write controlled sets of pieces with all the same cues, just one that has a happier affect than the other one. So this became a bit of a conundrum, and it led to what we call in the lab now the emotional piano project. And so the question that we were initially motivated by is this: is it possible to find a corpus of music where we have a balanced set of major and minor key pieces to see if composers writing major pieces wrote them higher and faster than minor? Now, the real problem with this is that music is overwhelmingly written in major keys. In fact, surveys show about 70% of Western common period practice is in major as opposed to minor. Now, as I thought more about this, I realized that Bach had solved this problem many years ago for a completely different reason. And so here he had written the Well-Tempered Clavier, which contains 48 pieces, 24 preludes and 24 fugues, each in one of the major and minor keys. In a sense, it's as balanced a music corpora as we were ever going to find. And as a bonus, it's some of the most widely performed and listened to piano pieces that I know of. Every pianist that I've ever met has played at least some aspects, some pieces from the Well-Tempered Clavier, and Bach literally wrote it as a training tool to help young musicians. This idea of writing a piece in a major and minor key inspired other composers such as Chopin, who wrote his well-known set of preludes in the same structure, in the sense that one piece is in each major and minor key. So this gave us, I think, an ideal corpus to try and explore this question of how composers actually use these cues when structuring widely heard and widely performed pieces. Now, to go about quantifying the cues, what we did is just identify the number of note attacks in each measure. So we can see there's 5 notes in the first measures here. The other measures have more notes. And then we just use the tempo of the piece to calculate out the number of note attacks per second. We used note attacks per second instead of tempi, which is done in a lot of studies because it provides a much better parallel to the way in which timing is quantified in speech, where it's usually number of phonemes per second or attacks per second there. So to calculate pitch height, we simply numbered each key on the piano and then mapped these onto each note that we saw for the first 8 measures. So here we can see middle C had a value of 40, the E above 44, and we just filled these in based on the piano. If you're not familiar with notated music, all that really matters is this is a method where we weighted the durations of each note to come up with an average pitch height for each measure. And so ultimately, we got a nice set of data that looks like this. In this example here, the very first piece we analyzed, the C major prelude by Bach, we came up with an attack rate of 7.4 note attacks per second. You can see it's the same across all 8 measures because we have the same rhythmic structure in the first 8 measures. I put here a little star on the page where we have the pitch height, and you can just see it moves up or down, tracking the material that we have each measure there. So this allowed us to calculate in exquisite detail, measure by measure, what we're seeing, so we can crunch the numbers and explore how the cues are actually used in pieces by these great composers. And I think this provides a nice counterpart to some more controlled experimental work, which looks at if we take a sequence and manipulate it in certain ways, what might the response be? So here we're seeing how these things are used in their sort of natural environment. And we have 2 dimensions we're looking at. For pitch height, we have the duration weighted average on the y-axis there, and I'll plot that out for each of the 8 measures. And for timing, again, we're using attacks per second, also for the first 8 measures. The bottom line is, when it comes to pitch height, major key pieces were about a major second higher than their minor key counterparts, and timing was about 30% faster. And that's across this whole corpus of pieces by Bach and Chopin. So I thought this was really exciting because, to the best of my knowledge, this was the first actual natural study of how these cues are used by these great composers. Nonetheless, it left us sort of wanting a bit more, because we started wondering, okay, we know how these cues are used, but how are they actually perceived? Like, can we figure out how they're affecting listeners' responses? Now we have this great detailed information. Can we actually understand how much each cue is contributing to that response? So for this, we moved our work from the library into the lab and decided to explore the issue of how these cues are perceived by playing pieces for listeners. Here, we used an experimental setup where we had users listen to or participants listen to all these excerpts, and they rated first the valence and then the arousal, which is a standard way of monitoring emotion in the musical literature. We can look at these on this so-called circumplex model and plot out where each piece falls, collapsing across all the users. So this study here was led by Amy Babcock, who finished her PhD in December of 2019, just before we entered a very new era. So I was glad we were able to do all of that stuff in person. So this gave us an exciting opportunity to explore how performances by great pianists like Frederic Goulda are interpreted and perceived by listeners, because we had all the cues extracted already. And in doing this, we were able to plot out on this circumplex exactly where all these pieces fall. And what's really exciting here is that we can see in different quadrants how this unfolds. So if we start here with this upper right, these are the high arousal, high valence pieces, and we can see there's a lot of major key pieces there. In the bottom left, we have these low valence, low arousal pieces, mostly minor key pieces over there. There was actually very few in the other two quadrants, but there were a couple. And so we can see essentially we have this linear relationship between arousal and valence, at least in this set of these pieces by Bach. Now I'm just showing you the preludes here in the interest of time, but the paper has the analysis of the preludes and the fugues as well. Now looking at this, I was really excited because I thought maybe this is an interesting opportunity to address this long-standing debate in the music theory versus psychology world about the role of modality. Because you can see here, if we do a split based on the valence, positiveness or the negativeness, there's 24 pieces. So out of the top 12, 11 are major keys. And if we look at the bottom 12 in terms of valence, well, again, 11 out of the 12 are minor keys. So I think it provides some interesting and important evidence that the major key pieces really truly are rated, in a sense, happier, at least higher in valence than their minor key counterparts. And so I found that to be an interesting step in trying to understand all this. Except maybe it's not. Because remember, what we found in the Frontiers paper in 2015 is that the major key pieces are also higher and faster. And so up here, like if we look at the C sharp major prelude, yes, it happens to be in the major mode, but it's also pretty high and fast. So I started thinking, maybe this doesn't really actually solve that problem. And actually, maybe this is the very thing that a lot of my music theory colleagues are really frustrated by, because these cues are, in the words of another colleague, hopelessly confounded. Now, in a lab, we can design a sequence to try and pick apart these different cues, but in natural music, the kinds of things that we choose to listen to that we find so artistically fulfilling, they are intentionally organized. So I'm reminded of that saying that one man's trash is another man's treasure. And I think here, maybe a psychologist's confound is the artistic's raison d'entrant for writing music in a certain way. So I think it gets to the heart at one of the challenges in trying to go about building a fuller understanding of music, that there's questions that we can answer perhaps better with analysis. There's other questions that are better suited for experimental testing. So to try and pick this apart, we were trying to think about how we can move beyond this problem that we're facing with these hopelessly confounded cues. Now, I know one way this is often pursued is through using very simplified stimuli so we can manipulate certain parameters in a tightly controlled way. While that can be helpful for answering some questions, I often find this to be a little bit musically unfulfilling, to see a whole study of musical emotion based on sounds that I would never choose to listen to outside of a lab. And so this, for a while, sort of felt like this wall that we were banging our head against. Like, it's potentially a very interesting way to understand and gain some insight into musical emotion, but at the same time, we're dealing with what Uslan called these hopeless confounds. And that reminded me of this story that I'd heard about years ago of a conversation that the famous composer John Cage relayed he'd had with another composer, Alan Schoenberg. And Schoenberg had been suggesting to Cage that he really needed to get comfortable with having a feel and understand for harmony to be a great composer. And Cage's response was that I just don't have any real gut feeling for how harmony works. So Schoenberg's response was, well, until you do, then harmony is going to be this obstacle and it'll be this wall through which you could never pass. And Cage's famous response was, in that case, I shall devote my life to beating my head against that wall. And I think that quote comes to mind when I think about this juncture of the research, because I felt like for a while we were beating our head against the wall. And how can we deconstruct these hopelessly confounded cues so that we can explore musical emotion in a way that doesn't require moving to sounds that are very outside of the kinds of sounds we choose to listen to in music? And the answer to this came through an amazing statistical technique that we stumbled across after a lot of exploration called commonality analysis. Now, I'll spare you the gory technical details, but essentially the way it works is this. Imagine we have three cues that all share some kind of relationship. And so each cue is doing something on its own, but also doing something in conjunction with the way it works with other cues. So to borrow a figure adapted from this paper by Capraro and Capraro, imagine we have the cue of attack rate coded here in blue, modality coded in green, and pitch height coded in purple. There are certain areas of this that are unique to pitch height, certain areas where pitch height is overlapping with modality or pitch height is overlapping with attack rate, and other areas where the three are overlapping on their own. Essentially, what commonality analysis does is allow us to pick apart the unique and shared contributions to predicting responses. Now, although to the best of my knowledge, this had not previously been applied to music, there is evidence of this being used in literature for many decades. One of the early studies that I found was designed to try and better understand the best practices for promoting an effective yet unpleasant medical treatment in an at-risk population. So here, an organization was trying to figure out what's the best messaging campaign? Where do we put our dollars to try and advertise the most effectively? Well, when they surveyed the groups here, what they found is there were three interrelated factors that seemed to be all entangled here in trying to clarify what's important about this procedure. The first were the group's feelings towards the exams themselves. The second one was their beliefs about the approaches being used. And the third were their views on the appropriateness of the treatment. Now, each of these had some kind of relationship with the other. And when they crunched the numbers looking at only the unique contributions of these three different dimensions, here it looked like the views on appropriateness had very minimal effect because that unique contribution was very low. But using commonality analysis, they realized that actually, if you account for the views perspective, both as a unique predictor and its shared contributions with the other things, that's actually the most powerful and important perspective here on which to focus the advertising. So that's one example of how commonality analysis, I think it can be a really, really useful tool in these kinds of complex real world situations where we have a lot of different variables working together. So we decided to see if we could apply this to music to try and unweave some of these so-called hopeless confounds. So there's a lot of number crunching, and if you want, we can go into it in detail later on, or you can read about it because the paper is now in press. But essentially, when we put it all together, we find this. So on the y-axis now, I have the amount of variance explained. I'm going to show a simplified figure, and then we're going to zoom into what commonality analysis lets us see on the inside. And so we're going to look at how much of the cues are predicting the responses, both for the valence dimension and for the arousal dimension, those two aspects that participants are rating. So we have three different cues. We're looking at attack rate and mode and pitch height, and we have these for each of those two dimensions. So we can see when we do this that overall attack rate and mode are really driving the valence ratings much more than pitch height, which is interesting because pitch height is thought to be a strong predictor in a lot of lab-based experiments. And when it comes to arousal, it seems that we're mostly being driven by attack rate. So one thing I thought that was fascinating about this is going back to that earlier question about what mode actually means. Because I think maybe part of the confusion and the disagreement between different camps is that there's at least two dimensions that we can be looking at simultaneously for emotion, the valence and the arousal. And it seems like in this set, modality is doing a lot of predicting of the responses for valence and not much for arousal. So to some extent, I think some of the confusion between the different groups comes from looking at these different aspects of emotion. And in that sense, I think if we take a detour to go back to this distinction between the music theory perspective and the experimental psychology perspective, sort of unpacking what it is when we're talking about these emotional responses is really important. Now here, I think psychologists generally separate these dimensions fairly effortlessly. I think it's more, in my talking with music theory colleagues, more on that side where we're not having as much of the distinction between the different ways of thinking about emotion. Now, at the same time, there's many different ways to model musical emotion, and that's a very complicated issue in and of itself. But the important take-home message from this is that when it comes to something like understanding modality, part of the confusion, I think, comes from these different dimensions that we've got here. But remember, we're entering this fight, not just with our normal statistical tools, but also with the insight we can gain from commonality analysis. And so we can actually pick apart the contributions and look at the shared and joint aspects of that. And when we do that, we can see that although attack rate and mode are each contributing strongly, a lot of that comes from that variance that's jointly explained by both of them. So we have that bluish greenish area, which we can see up top in the screen here, is that area shared by modality and attack rate. And so that bar, that block, exists in each of these different sections here. So pitch height, there's not that much to pick apart there. But when we do this for the arousal ratings, we can see that attack rate uniquely is doing the lion's share of the predictions here, but it also has these interesting shared aspects with mode and also with pitch height. And all the pitch height's contributing more there. A lot of that comes from its shared variance explained with attack rate. So we're excited about this because I think it provides an interesting way to address this hopeless confound of cues in natural music, so we can start to explore emotion in a very nuanced way amongst pieces that we listen to very frequently. But we started to realize that there was actually another really interesting opportunity to apply this even further. Because, as I'm sure many of you are familiar with, music changes considerably over time. This is why we have music history classes focusing on music of different eras. And so historians have divided different periods that are clearly demarcated with different styles. But what's interesting is that when we talk about how music is communicated, emotion is communicated in music, we typically treat music in that sense as a rather monolithic thing. And if this cue is predictive in music, then we sort of assume that works that way for all music, or at least all Western common period practice music. So this is an important issue because there's growing evidence that not just we have changes in musical eras, which we know, that's why they're different eras, but the ways in which cues are used and their meaning changed over time. So several years ago, there's this wonderful paper by Horn and Huron, and that's the same Huron that initially suggested the happy xylophone study many years ago, that did a wonderful analysis of different kinds of cues like mode and tempo and also dynamics and articulation, and split this apart in music from different eras. And they used a technique called cluster analysis to try and figure out how the cues were clustering together. They found something really interesting and potentially bizarre happening in the Romantic era, which is the period of time in which Chopin was writing. So music prior to the Romantic era, when they looked at the clustering, found that the most important way to carve up this data was starting with modality, and that kind of distinction drove a lot of the other subsequent lower level groupings. Now, when they looked at music from the Romantic era, modality no longer played the same kind of defining role. And they've unpacked this to a large degree in a number of other papers, showing that mode started to mean something different in the Romantic era when Chopin's writing. And I thought this is really, really fascinating because it's starting to show empirically that there might be certain differences in the way these properties get interpreted at different periods of history. Now, these analyses and their subsequent ones are all based on careful, detailed examination of musical scores. And so the question we wanted to do is start to explore moving beyond the scores and doing some perceptual testing and seeing whether we're responding differently to the music from these different eras. So here, we went back to the lab, used our same paradigms, having people rate the different aspects of dimension. But now one of my current graduate students, Cam Anderson, has been leading the charge looking at the perceptual experience of listening to the Chopin preludes. So I played you one brief excerpt of that earlier by a well-known performer of Chopin, Ashkenazi here, and we ran them through the same experiment, got the ratings, did the cue analysis, and we're able to do commonality and everything else, because this is the opportunity now to move beyond just an analysis of the score and start to look at a perceptual aspect at how music from the Romantic era and music from prior to the Romantic era might actually be sort of built on different ingredients that are affecting listeners in different ways. So what we found here when we pick this apart is that we can see, in contrast to Bach, where we have a distinction or attack rate and mode functioning more or less equivalently, here modality is playing a much, much greater role in Chopin's music. And also pitch height seems to be doing something more significant here, which is more aligned with what we've seen previously in some other experimental studies. But now again, we have the commonality analysis, so we can pick this apart. And this is where we can see another really interesting distinction between Bach and Chopin. So here we can see that the contribution from mode is primarily from the unique contribution of mode, but also a bit from how it relates with pitch height. And so I think this gives us at least two things that are importantly different between Bach and Chopin. One is that mode seems to be playing a much bigger role, and two is that mode is sort of mixed together with things in different ways. Now, before we wrap up, I should just say here, an important limitation in interpreting all of this is that we have to be mindful of what we are and what we are not showing. So as we think about how music has changed over musical history, I'm the first to admit that it's not necessarily entirely accurate to take one composer from each era and claim this composer generalizes to the entire era. I mean, moreover, we have one set of pieces from each of the composers. And so I think there's a lot of work in the future that we need to do to try and expand this out. Nonetheless, it's fascinating because now we can start to provide some perceptual evidence to look at this fascinating issue about how music is structured differently at different points in time. And so in a sense, I think this can be a useful connecting link between the kinds of approaches that we see in music theory and then the kinds of approaches that are often used in experimental situations. And my goal and the goal of my team in doing this work is to try and help contribute not only to our understanding of how music works and the guts of how things are structured and why Chopin and Bach chose to use cues in certain ways, but also inform our understanding of how the mind processes these sounds. I think it's really fascinating, in particular, because it's showing that there's some flexibility in our communication structures, and we're switching the ways in which we're using cues at these different times. So before we wrap up here, I just wanted to thank the speakers again for hosting me. I think it's great to have an opportunity to talk about this program right here on my own campus. I feel like most of the time the lectures are focused on other places, so it's great to be able to connect with other folks here at McMaster. I want to acknowledge the funding agencies that make all this work possible, and more importantly, the students who have been doing all this in the lab. Matt Poon led our charge on the cue extraction many years ago. We have a whole team that have been doing a lot of the analyses for the perceptual things, and then a small army of undergraduate research students that have been very helpful in meeting participants and running experiments, because most of this work was actually done in person in the lab before COVID. So again, thank you so much for having me. I wanted to leave a little bit of time for questions at the end, so I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have now.
Thank you. So you can either put your questions in the chat, or also feel free to unmute yourself or raise your hand and ask a question, kind of the old-fashioned way. Yeah, David.
Hi, Mike. Thanks for a fabulous talk. That was great.
Welcome. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, Mike. So you focused on the major versus minor modes. So I mean, I was wondering whether you'd done any thinking about other modes, and whether, I mean, there's all sorts of questions that arise from that. If you go to early music versus jazz and what happened in between. And I was wondering too about the time periods, about whether there was sort of convergence away, towards these two modes that are so prevalent, and then away from them. There seems some kind of dynamical system going on there, perhaps. I don't know. I just, in general, thoughts about other modes.
Great question. Well, hey, I'm a percussionist, so I think it's impressive I even know that there is a minor key. But yeah, I mean, that's a fascinating question. And folks who aren't as familiar with the sort of the evolution of musical history, we talk about major and minor as the two dominant modes, which they are, but there's a whole history of experimenting with other modes, many of which are still used in different ways. So even that is a bit of a simplification. So again, to quote one of my favorite David Huron quotes, is that we can't solve the whole world at once. And so, yeah, we started here. I think that would be great to explore. And this is one of the reasons why I think exploring this sort of artistic music, or what one of my students sort of slipped up and called real music, as opposed to science music once, is that we can explore those kinds of questions because there's a whole history of how these things are done. And I think if we can develop these techniques to use commonality analysis to pick apart these confounded cues, there's a whole new realm of things that are possible. So hopefully down the road, and hopefully that won't take another 20 years, we'll have some more insight into that. That's a great question.
Thanks.
Stephen?
I found this a fascinating talk.
Thank you.
Two questions from a complete outsider. One is, have you investigated the degree of variability in response to pieces of music as opposed to just the mean? Some things we might agree on, other pieces we might have, a population might have quite divergent views. That's my first question. And my second question, which may reflect my lack of knowledge in the area, how do we know that the response in terms of these sort of emotional responses of listeners in Bach's era was what you get in your lab now, or does that not matter? Yeah.
Yes, no, that's an excellent question, and it matters very much. Unfortunately, that's not the kind of question that I can think we can answer short of building a time machine to go back and find the music there. In terms of your other question about the responses and the consistency, I have a little bonus data slide here I wanted to share with you, because we've wondered about that a lot. How consistent are the responses? Also, how consistent are they with different performers? Because with Bach in particular, he's notoriously open to different interpretations. And in fact, I played a prelude and fugue on the marimba for my graduate recital, because it's a very big technical challenge to do that in the marimba. And I'll never forget, one of our pianists at Northwestern, where I did my master's, came up to me and he said, "Michael, after hearing you play, I've decided Bach is truly indestructible." And then he just walked away. And I was never entirely sure if that was a compliment or a terrible takedown, but Bach is truly indestructible. And so one of the questions we wanted to explore is, what kind of consistency do we see in these ratings amongst different composers? And so in a paper that'll be published soon in Journal New Music Research, we did the same experiment with 7 different highly regarded performances. And so you can see that there's some similarities overall in how things are structured, but there's also some interesting differences. I mean, you can see Goulda up here, these things are grouped sort of in 2 sections here, whereas, for Turek, it's more linear. And for some of the other pieces, we see a clustering in one performer versus another. But the most fascinating thing that came out of that study, which speaks to your first question about variability, is that we used an index of variability to look at where we see the most and least variability. And it's almost a perfect split, where there's much greater variance for the evaluations of the minor key pieces as opposed to the major key pieces. And we see that consistently in all 7 performers. What does this mean? I'm not entirely sure, but it seems like there's something more ambiguous about the minor key, which is fascinating because it harkens back to some of these distinctions between how music theorists and psychologists are thinking about these pieces in terms of what the minor mode means, and if it's Robert Hatton has talked about how it's marked, just being different than major is significant and open to more interpretations. So I think there's a lot of interesting things to be unpacked there. And I'll also need to talk more with some music theorists to try and get a better handle on some of those issues. Oh, Michelle.
Yeah, another question from someone from outside your field, and also not very familiar with this type of music, but thinking about popular music, I kept thinking throughout your talk about the Smiths. That is, a band that has, I think, a lot of music in major key, very fast, but the lyrics tend to be a little bit, kind of sad. And so I'm wondering if there are kind of related studies that kind of look at the text of lyrics for popular music that have words, or maybe even there's some of this for opera, and then compares that or juxtaposes that with kind of these issues of timing and mode and pitch. Because it seems like there might also be opportunities for research there about how different types of music juxtapose kind of what the the stated intent might be from the lyrics, and then the emotional intent of the music, or if there might even be ways to do this on a larger scale with like databases of music these days that people put comments on YouTube on videos or things like that, that you could outside of the lab, kind of out in nature, try to get at some of these things. So I'm wondering if that's something that there's research on, maybe that you haven't done, but that others are doing.
Yeah, that's a great question. And to some extent, that reminds me of when I read the abstract again this morning, I talked about the computational aspect of things. And then in the interest of time, I had sort of pulled that out. But to bring that back in, yeah, that's where I think some of the powerful computational tools from the, there's a whole community of ISMIR, it's the International Society for Music Information Retrieval, where it's possible to do some of those things at scale. And so I'm actually talking with a computational group in Linz right now about some possible extensions. We hadn't thought about lyrics per se, but that's a really interesting angle because that's a whole nother dimension of complexity. Right now, it's taken us 7 or 8 years to get to where we are with just the 3 Qs. So I don't know if we need to throw in some more, but that's a really cool idea. So I'll get back to you maybe in like 2035.
Excellent. We'll have you back if Spark is still around for that updated
excellent.
talk.
Hopefully in person by then.
Yes. I think we probably have time for one more question if there's anyone that wants to take advantage of this opportunity to ask another question. I've also put a short survey in the chat if you'll just take a second to let us know about this talk and if you have other suggestions, but any questions? Well, I want to thank you again, Michael, for taking the time to share your research with us. And thanks everyone for joining us. This was a great talk, and we're here every Friday. Well, not in this exact Zoom link, but in another Zoom link every Friday morning at 10:30. And so you can visit our website to see future events, or also suggest future speakers if you want to hear some research on your favorite topic. So thank you again very much, Michael, for joining us. And I hope everyone has a lovely weekend.
My pleasure. I just want to say as a final thought, if you're interested, we have a lot of information on our website, maplelab.net. And I'll also be back on the Spark series in January doing a talk about a totally different project about how understanding sound can save lives in hospitals.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Have a great weekend, everyone.